Welcome to Newt's World Podcast on the iHeart Podcast Network. Congress is technically on its 4th of July recess this week, but I want to talk about why they left town the way they did, because it tells you almost everything you need to know about the state of Washington right now. Before the break, the House Republican majority, narrow as it is, actually adjourned early, not because Democrats blocked them, because a dozen or so of their own members refused to move forward on the floor until leadership committed to bringing up election reform and immigration reform. Now, whatever you think about the specific policy fights, I want you to sit with that for a second. A dozen members of Congress said essentially, we're not going to keep doing business as usual while the single most basic function of a republic, knowing that only eligible citizens are deciding our elections, sits unresolved. I have some sympathy for this kind of stubbornness. I used to be that stubborn member of Congress myself more than once, and it's usually uncomfortable and usually right. Here's the backdrop. The Save America Act, legislation that would require documentary proof of citizenship to register to vote, plus photo ID at the polls, passed the House back in February with a real majority. Straightforward stuff. If you're a citizen, you should be able to prove it the same way you prove it to get on an airplane or open a bank account. But in June, the Senate failed to pass it. Failed. Not amended it, not negotiated it, blocked it outright. And I want to push back on something you're going to hear from the critics this week, which is the argument that non-citizen voting is so rare that this is all a solution in search of a problem. Here's my answer to that. The value of a citizenship requirement isn't just about catching fraud after the fact. It's about restoring basic public confidence that the system is trustworthy in the first place. You don't wait until the barn burns down to talk about smoke detectors. A republic runs on legitimacy, and legitimacy runs on people believing the rules are being followed. When the Senate can't even pass a bill saying only citizens vote in American elections, you shouldn't be surprised that trust in institutions keeps falling. Now, layered on top of this is the housing affordability bill, which, credit where it's due, passed with genuinely overwhelming bipartisan majorities, 85-5 in the Senate, 358-32 in the House. That's the kind of vote you almost never see anymore. And yet, the president has held it, declining to sign, insisting that Congress deal with the SAVE Act first. Love it or hate it as a strategy, it tells you that election integrity has become the fulcrum issue that everything else in Washington is being leveraged against right now. Let me remind you, if this bill didn't matter, you wouldn't have that many Democrats trying to block it. They know that it's important that we make sure that only citizens vote. When Congress comes back next week, they've got roughly 8 legislative days before things get tight again. A nearly $88 billion supplemental funding request on the table, a chunk of it tied to operations in Iran, foreign surveillance authority that must be addressed, and still no resolution on election reform. 8 days. It's not a lot of runway for issues this big. Here's my bottom line, and it's the same bottom line I've had for 40 years in and around Washington. Process is not a distraction from the big issues. Process is how the big issues get decided. A dozen House members holding the floor over election integrity isn't chaos for its own sake. It's a signal flare. It's telling leadership and telling the country that a meaningful chunk of the electorate does not consider this a side issue. If you want Washington to actually resolve it, the pressure campaign doesn't stop being on the Senate. Call your senators. Ask them directly why proof of citizenship to vote is controversial. Because I promise you, most Americans, when you ask them plainly, don't think that's a hard question. That's where things stand heading into a very consequential few weeks on Capitol Hill. Coming up, John Leganski, former Deputy Chief of Staff to Speaker Kevin McCarthy, joins me to go behind the scenes of the most dramatic speaker's race in the century, the subject of his new book, Glory, Grief, and the Gavel. That's next. I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, John Leganski. John is a political strategist and former senior congressional advisor who served as Deputy Chief of Staff to House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. During his time on Capitol Hill, he became the youngest floor director in House history and the first Republican aide to serve on the floor team for each of the top 4 House leadership offices: Majority Whip, Majority Leader, Minority Leader, and Speaker. His work has been cited by CNN, Politico, Roll Call, The Hill, Punchbowl News, and The Washington Examiner. He's now a partner at Harbinger Strategies, a leading government affairs firm in Washington, D.C. And he's joining me to discuss his new book, Glory, Grief, and the Gavel, an inside guide to running for Speaker of the House, a first-person account of the 2023 fight to elect Kevin McCarthy. 5 days, 15 ballots, the first multi-ballot speaker's race in a century. Full disclosure, I had the chance to read his book in advance, and as a former speaker myself, I can tell you it's one of the most detailed inside accounts of a leadership race I have ever come across. John, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's great to be with you.
What led you to believe this was the moment to tell this story?
Well, I took a step back after it all finished, and I said I have the beginning, middle, and end of this story. I started with Kevin as an intern in 2012 when he was Majority Whip at the time, and I served with him for 10 years. I saw the ups, the downs. We ran in 2015. We obviously stepped away from that race at that time. Paul Ryan became the speaker in that instance. But I think that's the hardest part of writing a book, is having that beginning, middle, and end. And as you noted, this was the first multi-ballot speaker's election in a century, the longest since the Civil War. There was literally no one we could talk about how to go through this. And so I thought that record being there was so important for what it looks like governing the House in the modern era.
Kevin really had a tumultuous process the whole way through. As you know, I like him very, very much. But at the same time, the House was in a mood where it was just really, really hard.
Totally. I split in the book, 2 camps. There's the maybe Kevins. That's the Chip Roy crowd, the Freedom Caucus crowd who, this, Mr. Speaker, there's always rabble-rousers who want to go further and want to push further to the right. Those guys we could work with. And then there was also just a rump group of, I called the Never Kevins. That was the Matt Gaetzes and others who, I think they were kind of legislative nihilists. They were there to cause chaos. That was their aim. And yeah, they were a constant thorn in our side, obviously, during the 15 rounds and in the months that followed. Speaker Johnson has his new group of folks that seem to be causing trouble. That's just kind of the nature of the beast in these modern times with slim margins in the House. And obviously, our challenge as well was we had a Democrat in the White House and Joe Biden, right? It's a little bit easier when you have the president of your own party, especially President Trump, with the power he commands, getting folks in line. We were having to cut deals to keep the government open and raise the debt ceiling with a Democrat in office, which is always a difficult proposition.
For you personally, you're a Stanford student from suburban Chicago. How do you end up in Kevin McCarthy's office in 2012?
Totally by happenstance. I was, as you mentioned, at Stanford. We had a DC program called Stanford in Washington, and they assigned everybody an internship during the day, and then you take classes at night. And I say it in the opening pages of my book. I rode up the Capitol South escalator with a piece of paper in my hand, and it said, Rep. Kevin McCarthy, Canon 326. That was his personal office. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know what the Majority Whip was or did. I was totally green when I came to town. But like so many others, I fell in love with the Hill and the process. And obviously, Kevin was just a tremendous boss to work for, but totally random. There was a Stanford grad in our office. I think that was how my application got plucked out of the pile. But one of those turns of fate that obviously turned out well for me.
Well, you were on I think it's fair to say, a really wild roller coaster. You're going in at a time when Obama's president and the House Republicans have a pretty big margin. Then you go through the Trump versus Clinton fight. Then you have a big loss in 2018. Kevin, I thought, was heroic in clawing back and inch by inch rebuilding the party. And then, of course, you end up in this brutal fight in which there are a handful of people, as you put it, nihilists, who are prepared to bring everything down on their terms. I suspect that they had no notion that that process would lead to Mike Johnson and to Trump becoming so amazingly powerful, because he had to fill the vacuum. When you think about it, though, so you arrived from Stanford, but of course you're saying politics in Chicago, which is in itself kind of a brass knuckles experience. What were your initial reaction to being in the House, and what advice would you give young people who themselves may want to follow in your path?
As you noted, there were a lot of those historical moments, and I wrote all those down in a journal. I would say that if you get into the Hill, you don't have to do it daily, but you'll know when those moments are that are worthwhile and you want to write down. And one of the first ones I had was Eric Cantor lost his primary a year after I came to Kevin's office. The entry I wrote down that night was, take nothing for granted. You can't expect just because your boss is next up in line to be chairman or in leadership. You have to take nothing for granted. You kind of got to be prepared for all outcomes. I don't know if I followed this or subscribed to this advice, but something that former Vice President Dick Cheney told me when I met him on the Hill was, hope for chaos. You might appreciate that line coming from Mr. Cheney. But he said that. He said, Watergate happened, everyone left, and I became the youngest White House chief of staff. I don't ascribe to that philosophy necessarily, but I did see that. In fact, a lot of chaos and turnover does create opportunities. The best advice I got was from James Min, our deputy chief. This is the advice I'd give to the young folks is chase work and responsibilities, not title and salary. If you do, those will follow. But that was, I think, my path was just kind of finding any little corner in the office where I could help out Kevin, any project I could work on. That helped me understand how he thought, how our conference thought, anticipated what they wanted to do, and then just go out and figure out how to get it done, right? I found that was my best path, more so than occupying any position on the org chart. It was just, constantly being involved and around the ball. You don't worry about the title so much. That'll come when you have the trust of your boss.
I think that's exactly the right advice. And I would add, be interested in everything. You never know when something which doesn't seem important suddenly becomes the centerpiece. Now, I think the Eric Cantor defeat was a signal of the depth of unhappiness in a way that was a huge shock when Cantor, I think, was generally considered one of the smartest, best organized, most disciplined people. And he and Kevin and Paul Ryan had formed a sort of a Young Guns program, which was trying to recruit new people, trying to strengthen the party. I thought it was also interesting. Paul Ryan is extraordinarily smart. Kevin's probably a better politician. And I was shocked when Ryan stepped down the way he did, because it seemed to me it put Kevin in a very difficult challenge, because here you are going into a very tough election, which we're going to lose. The guy who's in charge of campaigning basically quits in the middle of the campaign. Kevin then picks up the pieces after the defeat. I always thought that was challenging because Ryan is very, very smart about policy, but I felt like he never quite got a grip on the kind of power you have to be an effective speaker.
Yeah, well, I read a chapter about the Young Guns, and it all kind of got jumbled up because the plan was, Eric Cantor was the leader, and he was going to be the speaker. Paul Ryan was the thinker, and he was going to lead the budget committee and the Ways and Means committee and reform our entitlements and get our tax code in order. And then Kevin was the strategist, as you mentioned. He was focused on winning elections, electing more Republican, and he did this. He helped take back the House twice, elected more Republican women, minorities, and veterans than ever in our history. And the last line of that profile by Fred Barnes in the Weekly Standard was, Kevin will be right behind Eric Cantor as, majority leader one day and maybe even House Speaker. It was like, maybe this will happen. And obviously things got jumbled a little bit. Eric, as you mentioned, had his primary. Paul was thrust into that role. Listen, I think it was helpful to have a fresh face. I think Kevin saw that at the time. It wouldn't have been great to go from Boehner and a tumultuous leadership race to another one over Kevin. Paul was fairly unanimously the choice of our conference at that time. So I think that was helpful. He stepped down, and Kevin and him had that conversation when he told him that he was going to announce his retirement. It definitely had an effect of taking the wind out of our sails, I think. And listen, that election would have been tough no matter what.
Paul also had the great advantage that Mitt Romney picked him to be the vice presidential candidate. So he had at a stature level, he had a huge advantage in addition to being genuinely brilliant. But I had the same experience. When Jim Wright stepped down, the Democrats were in turmoil, And they ended up picking Tom Foley, who'd been chairman of agriculture. Foley's a wonderful person, but he never paid his dues to figure out how to be speaker. And he could never get working control of the conference. He hadn't had to spend the time forging the relationships. And I always thought Paul got caught in a very similar situation, whereas clearly, Kevin knew every member, knew every district, had raised an immense amount of money, had been on the road constantly, and that's what made me personally so angry at the handful of people who decided that they would rather destroy Kevin than get something positive done, because I felt that as much as anybody I knew in the modern era, Kevin had really paid his dues and he knew what he was doing. It was beginning to really work. And we were getting a younger, more idea-oriented party. In Boehner's case, he had actually led the party to a huge victory. They actually gained more seats in 2010 than we gained in 1994. And so I would have thought he was in a position to be very comfortable, except I think he was caught between an overmatch with Obama, who was just so slick and so dishonest that I think it made it extraordinarily frustrating for John, who really is a down-to-earth, small business kind of guy. This was not the kind of fight that he'd have fun with. Now, you say that Kevin's first bid for Speaker, which was during the collapse as Boehner leaves, was really affected by some comments that McCarthy made about the Benghazi Committee. Can you put that in context?
Sure. So we were the odds-on favorite to become the next speaker. He was majority leader at the time. That was the fastest rise for any backbencher to whip to majority leader. I think he did it in a matter of 6 years or less. And so now we're running for speaker, and we did a bunch of press. We did a bunch of media. I have had a little experience with it doing this book. I realize how draining it can be to go on show after show after show, and you're repeating yourself. You're not sure what you said on the show, or you're trying to make it sound interesting. And, Sean Hannity at that time was the dominant force on Fox News primetime. He's obviously still a force, but that was his apex, I would say, in terms of king-making ability, right? And he could make your career sink or swim with an interview. And so we went on that show, and Kevin's advice that he was given before that show was be angry, which was definitely in keeping with where the base and the Fox News viewership was in 2015. Like you said, well into the second term of President Obama, but cut against every one of Kevin's natural instincts. The man doesn't have an angry bone in his body, right? And so he went on there, and I think he was trying to show his teeth and show that he was a fighter. And that was the comment he made was, he tried to point to the select committee as an example of how, we can get results. And the way he phrased it was, you see what happened with Hillary Clinton. People thought she was unbeatable. And what's happening now? Her numbers are dropping because you can't trust her. And they tied it and they said, see, this committee was political. It's very quaint to think nowadays that was a scandal that could take somebody, through the washer like we were. Nowadays that would go through Twitter in about 5 seconds and wouldn't even get registered. But at the time, it was a big deal. The biggest problem was it gave, an opening on the right. The left hated us. They were going to oppose us. But, it led to people like Mr. Massey, who's been at presidents in D.C. for many years, to start to come out in opposition. Jason Chaffetz announced he was running. He didn't actually peel that many votes away, but it was a credible kind of alternative that muddied the waters. And so we were looking at it, and Kevin had the votes. I think we had a path to a 218 vote speakership, but a very narrow one at that time. And he said, listen, if it's going to cause so much heartburn that we just went through this Boehner saga, and now I'm going to be putting myself out there and making folks take tough votes, which is what his friends were telling him. I'll vote for you, but it's going to be hard back home, right? They are not in the mood for just promoting the next man up right now. He took that to heart and said, fine, I'll stay as majority leader. Let's get a fresh face. But it is quite quaint to think that, like I said, that was a scandal at the time that derailed us.
When we come back, we'll go inside the 5 most dramatic days in the modern history of the House of Representatives, the 15-ballot floor fight for Speaker of the House. Walk us through that whole process of the handful of people decide that they're bigger than the whole rest of the House. It had to have come is just an enormous shock to Kevin that they were that bitter and that hostile.
Yeah, it was, in one hand, shocking for sure, because like you said, I mean, we just take back the House. It's no easy feat. I think people take for granted you just can win the House, right? I mean, it's tough. It is hard to win back the House. You know how hard it was. You took the Republicans out of the wilderness in 40 years, right? It's no easy feat to win back that chamber. And so we just scored this tremendous victory. It wasn't as big as, we had hoped for, or maybe some pundits had predicted, but winning the House, Kevin's line was, they don't give you gavels in small, medium, and large. They just give you the gavel. We have the gavels, and we can now go prosecute, the case against Joe Biden and his administration, the failures. And Kevin won the supermajority of the vote in the conference. I think we had 188 votes out of our members. And I hear both sides. They have the Hassert rule in one hand, where they say, if you have to have a majority of the majority. And then I'd say to them, great, well, we have a supermajority of the majority. Why are you not with us? That was a shock. On the other hand, again, I think we knew that some of these guys were not willing to play ball. I quote Matt Rosendale, former member from Montana in my book, who said he and his brethren were praying for a small majority. They were actually praying for us to win as few seats as possible, which should tell you something about their psyche, just so they could, extract pain and extract, leverage on us. So, yeah, we went into that. We had some strategies, which I'd love to get into with you, that Dan Meyer and Vin Weber helped us cook up for surviving those 15 ballots. But, yeah, going into it, it was both surprising and not, given, some of these folks we were dealing with.
Do you think there was a number where there would never have been this rebellion?
I was hoping for like 230, right? We ended at 222. I think it would have been a much more front-loaded process. You saw Speaker Pelosi have to negotiate for her job a little bit. By the way, I think that's kind of going to be the norm moving forward. I had an interview that came out today in The Guardian where I said Hakeem Jeffries is looking at these Democrat socialists who are saying, I'm not voting for anyone for leadership that took corporate PAC money. I said, he's going to be noting that down. But I was hoping for 230, and I write about you guys in the war room that election night, and the mood just kind of kept getting dimmer and dimmer. I recount the conversation Kevin had, you'll remember this, with Dave Wasserman of the Cook Political Report. And he actually said, I think I may be calling you Mr. Minority Leader for another term, Kevin. You could have heard a pin drop in the room. And we marched over to the broader war room where they had all the, election nerds following district by district. And Kevin counted out, at least a path to 218 so he could go give his speech. But the counts kept dropping. They said, we can get 228. Then it was 226. Then it was 224. Then it was 222. And I said, geez, that's about as snug as we can get it, I think. And obviously we were able to sneak it out. But I thought if we were at 230, that's a much more manageable conference. These 220s, low 220s, it's just hard. It's hard.
I always tell people that I could never have done what Johnson has done because I had to have a big enough majority that you could have 6 or 8 idiots and just govern without them. Kevin didn't have at that point the sheer power of Trump. It's the Trump-Johnson team that has really been effective in the House. You write about something interesting that I'd never quite thought about until your book, and that is a distinction between the never Kevins and the maybe Kevins. Walk us through that. And by the way, I want to say, for anybody who's listening, this is the kind of detailed insight in the House that is vital, because the House is 435 people, and you have to be able to analyze to a pretty narrow degree which group is which, what they need, and what they're looking for. So I'm very curious to get your take on the never Kevins and the maybe Kevins.
Yeah. Well, I'll start with the maybe Kevins, right? Those are the guys, more Freedom Caucus members. I do think the House is becoming a pseudo-parliamentary system where you have 2 parties nominally, but there are different shades underneath. And the Freedom Caucus is that quasi-third party where I felt that's what the 15 rounds were about, was us patching together, cobbling together a coalition government like you see in parliaments around the world. And so Chip, he wasn't the chair of the Freedom Caucus at the time, but I thought he was the center of gravity of that group. And I felt they were trying to get, and I heard this from his staff and the executive director of the Freedom Caucus, Tim Wright, who I worked with closely during this time period. They were trying to get more influence for their group, trying to get the camel's nose under the tent, maybe have a seat on the steering committee, have a seat at the leadership table, have, more representation on some of the broad committees. And Kevin was fine with that because his mentality was, listen, that was our process. How do we govern with a 3, 4, 5 seat majority? we need everybody on the takeoff and we need everybody on the landing. So sure, I'll put you guys on rules. I'll put you guys on approps. I'll put you guys on ways and means. I'm also going to put moderates on there, and you guys can go hash it out and figure it out so that when it comes to the floor, you guys have already seen it, know what it's in it, have worked out the kinks. So that group was about 15 or so, I would say, mostly Freedom Caucus members, and they had some rules changes. They had some budget targets they wanted to hit. I would note as well in the end, we met every single commitment we made to those guys. We upheld, we exceeded. We enacted the largest deficit reduction bill in history in the Fiscal Responsibility Act. So those guys, I don't think, had any grounds to be mad with us, and none of them voted against us when the motion to vacate came. That other group, though, the Never Kevins, that was your Matt Gaetz-led group. And, they started coming out publicly giving themselves no wiggle room. I will never vote for Kevin for speaker. Those were a gut punch in the lead up to January, right? And you knew they weren't really bluffing. I didn't expect Matt Gaetz to change his mind, or Bob Good or some of these other folks. They were, I don't know exactly what the root of all their issues with Kevin was, but like I said, some of it was nihilism, some of it was just trying to sow chaos for the sake of chaos. But that group, we kind of said we need to go around, right? We got to just sideline them and, make it such that this is an unwinnable fight for them, but there's nothing we could give or offer or change that will appease them. They're just a hard no.
Was that ideologically driven, personality driven?
I think personality driven, you look at the trigger. What was our sin ostensibly that led to all the Democrats and those 8 Republicans voting to remove Kevin was a 30-day government funding continuing resolution, right? Which is pretty routine. A lot of those members said, well, no, I can't do this. I'll never vote for a CR. And they voted for 7 more CRs over the following 2 years, many of which under President Trump, So these strongly held principles seem to only go one way. And yeah, there were personality conflicts with Kevin and these members. Again, I don't know quite what the root of some of them were. I asked some of these guys too. I asked Andy Biggs, what is the beef? He said, oh, Kevin knows why. And I asked Kevin, I said, do you know why? Do you know why Andy doesn't like you? He said, I have no idea. I don't know. So some of it was that. And Matt Gaetz had his ethics thing going on as well on the side. But it wasn't one unifying thing, but it wasn't policy. It wasn't ideology. It was personality.
Well, you did tell an interesting story about Kevin talking with Andy Biggs and then merging in President Trump. That must have been a little bit of a shock to Biggs.
I think so. That was in between, the first and second Trump terms. And so he was still obviously very engaged and powerful, but was not whipping rules and stuff like he is these days. And that was right before the 14th ballot. We had left the floor with Matt Gaetz and an understanding that he was going to vote for Kevin for speaker. And we had the votes. And then those guys started to backtrack on it. And so Kevin said, all right, who else can we get? All right, well, let's try Andy Biggs, And so he called them. And we were having a conversation. I didn't know he was going to do this. Andy certainly didn't know that he was going to do this. But he said, all right, I'm merging in the president. And President Trump gets on the line and unloads quite a tirade. I didn't know he could let expletives fly like that. He doesn't really do that in public. So it was impressive to me that he's able to, moderate that in public. But in private, it was certainly quite a scene. And Andy and his friends obviously broke, shortly thereafter, voted president and allowed us to go over the top.
You finally get it done. 1:30 in the morning, January 7th, and you're right there in the middle of the fight. What was your feeling after Kevin got up there, took the gavel, and it was done?
Well, it was finally the first moment I could sort of breathe all week and just enjoy it and take it in. I was on pins and needles the whole week leading up to it. I lost 10 pounds, which I don't have to lose, so I was quite stressed, but I just felt tremendous pride. Like you said, this was a guy that earned it. He paid his dues. He worked so hard. I'd seen him at his highs and at the lows, and it just felt very validating for everything, our team had done. He earned it. He deserved it. He was so well tailored for that role, a man of the house. He was a district director. That was his start. He was an intern for Bill Thomas back in the day. It was just such a quintessential story of the house that I felt tremendous pride in him and how he handled himself that week. You always reminded us cheerful persistence is the way. I think he embodied that week. My wife was able to come down to the floor. She's a house staffer, still up there working. And so I was able to give her a big hug and kiss. That was tremendous. I had family and friends in the gallery, all of our staff in the gallery as well over the years. So it was just a really cool moment for us kind of to own that. And I write in the book after the members congratulating Kevin died down, he and I had a brief moment, and, we shook hands, and he said, my man. And I said the two words that I've been waiting to say for over a decade to him. I just said, Mr. Speaker. And it's a moment I will never, ever forget.
Coming up, we'll discuss how the very coalition that delivered the gavel ended up tearing it away just 9 months later, and what that means for the future of Congress. Everything seems to be working, and then 9 months later, it's a disaster. What happens?
The truth of the matter is that we didn't have 218, right? Even that first night we won, we had 216 votes. And as being Speaker, you need 218 votes to do anything, right? You can't adjourn the House if you don't have 218. The calendar that we put out, that's all predicated on you can enforce your will with the rules of 218 people. The rulings of the chair, right? All that is predicated on you having 218 votes. And while it was great to win, there was a rocky foundation, right? And there was kind of that risk all along that if this guy and his group of misfit toys don't want to play along, well, then we're really in a tough spot. And so we started to see that after the debt limit deal, which again also was ironic. I didn't include this in the book, but Matt Gaetz talked to us about that debt limit deal right before we put it on the floor. And he said, it's like a kidney stone. It's painful, but you just got to pass it and move on. And I said, yeah, you get it, right? I mean, we have to do this. We have to raise the debt limit. We were able to extract quite a bit of concessions from Joe Biden on the spending front, largest deficit reduction bill in history. I think Matt Gaetz gave us an A as Speaker in May. So I'm sitting there saying, listen, we're doing as best as we can. And then, yeah, it flipped. I think there was some sense of discontent in the ranks after the debt deal. I think there were some folks that they had this shiny toy. They wanted to play with it, being the motion to vacate. I was under the belief that I thought at least some moderate Democrats might be counted upon to table a motion, Steny Hoyer and other institutionalists, but it came clear to me pretty quickly that was not going to happen. And I don't blame them. Listen, I get it, right? I get if Nancy Pelosi came to us or Hakeem Jeffries said, come to us and said, hey, can you vote president on this one so I can save my gavel? I mean, the answer is probably no. But it was a learning moment for the House. I think the House in some ways had to touch the stove and see how disruptive and disastrous that was. Matt Gaetz and his group get the focus, but the Democrats, I think, own this too. And October 7th happened that next weekend. The House was paralyzed to act. We could not send aid to Israel. And I've had many Democrats come up to me afterwards and say, listen, I hope you guys can forgive me. I hope Kevin can forgive me for, how we treated him because we can't go through that again. And so I was very happy to see when Mike Johnson faced the motion to vacate that there was a bipartisan group of R's and D's that came in and tamped that down. We don't have recalls in our system for a reason, right? I think the founders knew that that is not how you govern a republic, by having 100% unanimity at all times. And so if there's an impeachable conduct, sure, then maybe someone needs to be removed. But otherwise, I think the Speaker ought to serve 2 years, do the best they can, and then stand for re-election at the beginning of the next term. And if they win, great. If they don't, no problem. But, having these recalls in the middle of the term, we saw it firsthand how disastrous and dangerous that was for the House. I hope we don't go down that path again anytime soon.
The danger is once people learn how to do something, they can come back and do it. Now, when you watched Kevin work for years, learn the business, build the network of allies, raise the money, crisscross the country. And then here's Mike Johnson as a backbencher. And they finally get so exhausted. And you saw all this. Steve Scalise made a run. Jim Jordan made a run. Tom Emmer made a run. Nobody could put a majority together. It's almost like watching them select a pope. Somehow they just got so tired and they turned and said, all right, nobody particularly objects to Mike Johnson. He was the last man standing, and he wasn't even standing.
And it's funny you bring up the Pope and the conclave, because Pope Francis actually told Kevin that he was watching all 15 rounds with his staff from their offices in the Vatican. So they were enamored by the process, because it is. I think it's as close to electing a Pope as you get. And like you said, I think that was one of the biggest selling points for Mike's candidacy was no one objected, right? He hadn't made any enemies. No one could say for any given reason why they were opposed to him. In retrospect, his rise didn't totally shock me. On the cover of my book, Kevin is seated to my right and Mike Johnson is seated to my left every day. I think he was kind of paying attention and taking his own mental notes about, what does this process look like? And Where should I be maybe standing if the bouquet is to get thrown? And again, I don't fault him. Timing is everything in politics. He was in the right spot at the right time. And in some ways, listen, I think maybe that's what needed to happen for the House to govern, right? If these guys were just not going to go along with what we were doing just because Kevin was the face of it, then we're not going to continue to stand in the way of progress. But I think they were able to get the reconciliation bill done, obviously kept the government open, passed all those CRs I mentioned. You know, on paper, if you looked at the speakership of you and maybe John and Paul and Kevin and Mike, I mean, you guys all have to make these trade-offs in leadership. There are tough decisions you have to make. You come at it from a place of conviction and principles, but, you know, for these guys to expect the speaker to get everything they want on every deal, that's just not how it happens. But I think he's done a great job in the role. He certainly has benefited, like you said, from having Trump in office. I think he's also gotten a little more grace than maybe we got from some of the far right, which no problem. If that's what it takes to keep the House running, the House does find its level. And that was unfortunately for us, but I think true to the case, that was part of what needed to happen for all these things.
I think sometimes exhaustion leads to tolerance just because people just don't want to do it again. You're going to have to explain this because you quote Tom Massey of Kentucky, who may be the most hard-nosed, stubborn, and unshakable person in the Republican conference. And he said, quote, switching from McCarthy to Johnson was the biggest mistake I've seen conservatives make in my decade of serving in Congress. I have no explanation for it.
Well, every speaker, I think, has their thorns and then their roses. And for some reason, Tom and Kevin really got along. And that's a transformation because Thomas was one of the architects of the ouster of Boehner. I didn't know this until researching this book, but Mark Meadows gets a lot of the PR from the motion of vacate motion he authored against Boehner. But it was either him or Massey that was going to do that. Massey was the co-author of that. And it just ended up being Meadows was the lead. So Massey was no friend of leadership, but, you know, we brought him in, we put him on the Rules Committee, which is a powerful perch, and he was great on that committee. He was an honest referee. He would never vote for any rules that turned off member privileges, would allow for same-day fast track, anything like that, right? He said, as long as you're not breaking the rules, I'll vote for the rules. But if it's just a policy I'm not for, I'm not going to vote no and deny the body the chance to vote on it just because I'm opposed to the policy. I'm just here to enforce the rules. So that was kind of the start. And then I think the big thing for him was he had this plan that he was pitching in the lead up to us returning to power, which became kind of coined as the Massey plan, which was if we ever get into a situation where we're going to government shutdown, we just propose a 99% funded government, right? 1% haircut. How can they be opposed to that, right? That's our win. If we even just cut government by 1%, that's a win. And that was one of the triggers Kevin got in law in the debt deal with Biden was if you don't get all 12 bills done on time, regular order, then the government is cut by 1%. And so that was what Massey told us was, listen, I've heard speakers over the years make promises and not follow through on them. Not only did you make this promise and follow through on it, you got it enacted into law. So I'm going to vote for you and I'm going to vote for this plan every day of the week. So he was close with us. I don't know if the relationship deteriorated with Mike and obviously with Trump as well. You know, that relationship is not in a great place. You know, he was kind of the Ron Paul for us in the House where he's got his way. He's very stubborn. But for some reason, he was cool and he voted for a lot of the things we put forward. And he was a team player when Kevin was in office.
This is an important book because the House is a very complicated institution. I always tell people it's 435 high school class presidents. And I tell people, you know, presidents appoint cabinets and they can fire them. Well, the House elects its leadership. The leadership doesn't elect the House. It's a very complex system. I think you've done a real service to the country in taking the time to outline your experience from the inside. What do you most want readers to take away from Glory, Grief, and the Gavel?
Well, you sort of summed it up right there, right? The House is, in my opinion, the most fascinating legislative body in the country, right? You have 435 members, 218 votes to become the third highest officer in the land, a spot that you held. And some members have been there 40 days. Some members have been there for 40 years, but they all count the same and you have to work with all of them. So for the young folks out there, number one, I would say take more psychology classes. That's one thing I wish I had done more of. Less political science and more psychology, because that is truly what it comes down to. And there are a lot of good people serving, right? I felt that in my time, I had so many great mentors and members. You were a tremendous help to Kevin and us that I was fortunate enough to work with. I wanted to highlight some of those folks in the pages of this book because they're not the ones that get the headlines. They're not the ones that are on primetime news every night throwing the bombs, but they're the ones that make the system go, both the members and the staffers. And so that's my call at the end of the book is, listen, if you care about this system, if you care about our government, if you want America to go for another 250 years, we need good people. The quality of decisions your government makes is directly tied to the quality of individuals making those decisions. And so get involved. You can be like me, an intern riding up the escalator with no idea who Kevin McCarthy was or what the whip was, and go on a tremendous run for 10 years and have so many wonderful experiences and learn so much. I hope more kids out there do take the leap, and we'd be better for it.
That's a great summary. John, I want to thank you for joining me. I also want to thank you for writing the book. And your new book, Glory, Grief, and the Gavel, an inside guide to running for Speaker of the House, is now available wherever books are sold. So thank you very much for spending time with me.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I really appreciate it.
Thank you to my guest, John Leganski. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Join me on Substack at Gingrich360.net. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.